China has 6 of the 10 busiest ports on Earth. The United States has a remarkable talent for posting about China. One country is moving containers, the other is moving opinions. That's an exaggeration, obviously. America still has enormous strengths: its financial markets, its universities, its military, its technology companies. But the contrast is uncomfortable because every iPhone, solar panel, air conditioner, electric vehicle battery, and increasingly every piece of industrial equipment begins the same way. It has to move through a port. And ports are one of those things nobody thinks about until they stop working. During the pandemic, more than 100 container ships were waiting outside Los Angeles and Long Beach. Some sat there for weeks. The queue became so long that satellites could see it from space. American consumers experienced the result as higher prices and empty shelves. What looked like an inflation story was partly a logistics story. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, China was handling cargo volumes that are almost difficult to visualize. The port of Shanghai alone moved more than 50 million TEUs, 20-foot equivalent containers, in a year, 50 million steel boxes. If you line them up end to end, they'd circle the Earth several times. That number matters because containers are not just boxes, they're votes. Every container represents a factory producing something, a supplier financing something, a shipping company scheduling something, a port authority planning something, and a consumer somewhere waiting to buy something. Containers are physical evidence of economic activity, and China has a lot of evidence. The rankings are almost comical: Shanghai, Ningbo Zhoushan, Shenzhen, Qingdao, Guangzhou, Tianjin, 6 of the world's 10 busiest ports. The United States, the world's largest economy for decades, has exactly 1 port in the top 10, Los Angeles. That doesn't automatically mean China is winning. The world is more complicated than port rankings. The U.S. economy is more service-oriented and consumes far more than it manufactures. American companies still dominate sectors that generate enormous value with relatively little shipping volume. A billion-dollar software company doesn't need a container ship. But here's the problem. Civilizations occasionally confuse financial power with productive power. They assume money can always purchase whatever they need, whenever they need it. Then something breaks. Masks in 2020, semiconductors in 2021, critical minerals after that. Suddenly, everybody starts asking where things are actually made. Because the global economy eventually reduces to a simple question: if you need a physical object in large quantities and very quickly, who can build it and who can move it? The answer increasingly points toward one country, and that country's advantage didn't happen by accident. Back in 2006, Beijing approved the 11th five-year plan, with logistics and infrastructure as national priorities. Local governments competed to expand ports. State-owned enterprises poured money into terminals, rail connections, and industrial zones. The result wasn't just bigger harbors, it was an integrated machine. A factory in inland China can feed cargo onto rail networks, move it to a coastal port, load it onto one of the world's largest merchant fleets, and send it almost anywhere on Earth. Infrastructure isn't glamorous, which is why democracies often underinvest in it. There are no viral tweets about container throughput. Nobody gets millions of views by discussing automated gantry cranes. Although, to be fair, if an automated crane started posting online, it would probably have a better understanding of supply chains than most geopolitical commentators. The deeper issue here is that ports tell you something about a country's philosophy. A port is a bet on the future. You don't build one because you need it tomorrow. You build one because you think you'll need it 20 years from now. You dredge channels, buy cranes, build rail links, and expand terminals years before the cargo arrives. Which raises a question I've been thinking about lately. When China built 6 of the world's 10 busiest ports, what future did it think it was preparing for? And perhaps more importantly, what future did America think it was preparing for instead? The easy answer is globalization. China expected the world to keep buying things, so it built the infrastructure to sell the world more things. America expected globalization to continue as well, but from a different position. It assumed the high-value parts of the economy, finance, software, design, intellectual property, would matter more than the messy business of making and moving physical goods. For a long time, that looked like a brilliant trade. Why worry about shipyards when you have Silicon Valley? Why build steel mills when your companies design the products everyone wants? There is logic there, real logic. The United States generated extraordinary wealth by moving up the value chain. But then the system started revealing its hidden dependencies. Take a company called Yantian International Container Terminals in Shenzhen. Most people have never heard of it. Yet a COVID outbreak there in 2021 slowed operations and sent shockwaves through global shipping schedules. Thousands of containers were delayed. Freight rates surged. Companies in Europe and North America suddenly discovered that a disruption at a terminal on the southern coast of China could affect inventories half a world away. One port, one outbreak, global consequences. That should have been a bigger story than it was, because it revealed something uncomfortable. Efficiency had become concentration, and concentration creates leverage. People often discuss China's rise through military spending or GDP growth, but the more interesting question is whether the country has quietly accumulated logistical power, the ability to decide what moves, when it moves, and at what cost. That's a different kind of influence, less dramatic, more persistent. The port of Ningbo, Zhoushan handled more cargo tonnage than any port on Earth. Shanghai became the first port to cross 50 million containers annually. Chinese firms didn't stop at domestic infrastructure either. Through companies like the state-owned COSCO shipping ports, Beijing acquired stakes in terminals from Greece to Peru to the United Arab Emirates. The conversation in Washington often frames this entirely as a security issue, sometimes fairly. Ports can have strategic implications. Data matters. Ownership matters. But focusing only on security misses something. The commercial logic came first. China became the workshop of the world, and workshops need loading docks. Lots of them. There's another detail that rarely gets discussed. Building ports creates ecosystems around them. Manufacturers cluster nearby, suppliers move in, warehouses appear, shipping services expand. Insurance companies, customs brokers, truck fleets, rail operators, they all accumulate around the flow of goods. Ports don't simply handle economic activity, they attract more of it. This is why the numbers from the opening matter so much. Remember those 50 million containers moving through Shanghai? They're not just statistics, they're signals. They tell companies where infrastructure exists, where suppliers are located, where shipping costs can be minimized. Industrial gravity starts forming, and once industrial gravity forms, it's difficult to reverse. The United States knows this. That's one reason the Biden administration's industrial policies, the CHIPS and Science Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, subsidies for battery plants and semiconductor fabrication, were fundamentally about rebuilding productive capacity. People talk about these laws as if they're only climate policy or semiconductor policy. They're also logistics policy, because factories eventually need ports. Factories need rail. Factories need electrical grids. Factories need people who know how to move heavy things from one place to another. Reindustrialization isn't a press release. It's a supply chain. The challenge is that infrastructure compounds slowly. You can announce a factory this year and still wait years before the ecosystem forms around it. China has been compounding for decades. That's the part many people underestimate. And before anyone says, well, ports don't matter in a digital economy, consider this. Every data center requires electrical equipment, cooling systems, transformers, construction materials, backup generators, and servers. Artificial intelligence may run on code, but the physical machinery behind it arrives in containers. Even the cloud has a shipping department. I keep coming back to that because it changes how we think about power. The 20th century taught us to pay attention to armies and currencies. The 21st might force us to pay more attention to logistics. Which brings us to the question that makes this story more complicated than a simple China built ports and America didn't. Because despite all these advantages, there are reasons Beijing may not be as comfortable as those rankings suggest. And one of them sits on the deck of nearly every container ship in the world. The strange thing about shipping is that China dominates the cargo, but not every layer of the system carrying it. Look at the containers themselves. More than 95% of the world's shipping containers are manufactured by Chinese companies. That's dominance. Look at shipbuilding. China now produces more commercial vessels than any other country and has overtaken traditional giants like South Korea and Japan in several categories. Then look at global trade routes and a different picture starts to appear. A large share of the world's container fleet is operated by companies based in Europe and Asia, outside China. Marine insurance remains heavily centered in London. Global finance still underpins shipping in ways that run through Western institutions. The US dollar remains the currency in which most international trade is settled. This is where the story gets interesting. China has built an enormous machine for moving physical goods, but the operating system of global commerce is still partly written elsewhere. That's why both sides can claim they're indispensable, and both are partly right. Here's the reversal. The port rankings tempt us into believing this is a story about Chinese strength and American decline. It's not that simple. Because the real vulnerability isn't who has more ports, it's who depends on whom. China's economy still relies heavily on external demand. Its manufacturing sector needs overseas consumers, foreign markets, imported commodities, and uninterrupted sea lanes. The country's industrial engine consumes iron ore from Australia, copper from Chile, and energy from the Middle East. A huge percentage of those imports pass through maritime choke points. The Strait of Malacca, for example. At its narrowest point, it's only a few kilometers wide. A massive share of China's imported energy moves through that corridor. For 2 decades, Chinese strategists have worried about this dependency. They even have a phrase for it, the Malacca dilemma. Build all the ports you want, your economy still depends on ships reaching them. That's why Beijing has invested in pipelines through Central Asia, rail corridors into Europe, and ports along the Indian Ocean. The Belt and Road Initiative was never just about influence or prestige projects. Part of it was insurance, a search for alternatives, an attempt to reduce the number of single points of failure. The United States has its own dependencies, of course. American consumers rely heavily on imported goods. Many industries remain dependent on foreign supply chains. Washington's scramble for semiconductor resilience and critical minerals didn't happen because policymakers suddenly developed an affection for factories. It happened because they discovered how much had quietly moved offshore. Nobody likes finding out they're dependent on someone else. Countries especially don't like it. There's another complication. Some economists argue that China's port dominance is actually a symptom of an unbalanced economy. Too much investment, too much manufacturing capacity, too much reliance on exports. I think that argument deserves to be taken seriously. There are signs of excess in parts of the Chinese economy. Property troubles, local government debt, falling demographics, weak consumer confidence. These are not small issues. A country can build magnificent infrastructure and still struggle with structural problems. History is full of examples. But I also think some Western analysis falls into a trap. It assumes that because China has economic weaknesses, its industrial strengths somehow matter less. I don't see it that way. The ability to manufacture and move things at scale remains one of the hardest capabilities to build on Earth. You can't tweet a port into existence. You can't announce a shipyard and have it operating next quarter. You can't create generations of logistics expertise with a subsidy package and a press conference. These systems take decades, and that's why the rankings matter. Not because container throughput is destiny, because infrastructure reveals priorities. Remember the question from the first part? What future was China preparing for? I think the answer is becoming clearer. China prepared for a world in which physical production remained the foundation of power, even in the digital age. The United States prepared for a world where finance, software, and innovation would allow it to remain comfortably above the industrial layer. The truth is that both visions captured part of reality. The problem is that neither captured all of it, which leaves us with a much bigger question. If the next era belongs neither entirely to factories nor entirely to algorithms, then what does a winning economic model actually look like? Maybe it looks a lot like a country that can do both. That's where this entire story lands. The old argument was simple. Either you make things or you design things. Either you're an industrial economy or a knowledge economy. One side pours concrete, the other writes code. The 21st century is refusing to respect that distinction. An electric vehicle is software wrapped around minerals, factories, batteries, ports, and power grids. Artificial intelligence requires algorithms, but also semiconductors, transformers, cooling systems, and enormous quantities of electricity. Even space exploration, the most futuristic activity humanity does, is basically a supply chain problem with rockets attached. The countries that win the next few decades will probably be the ones that can combine advanced technology with industrial depth. That is much harder than it sounds. The United States is trying to rebuild pieces of its manufacturing base while keeping its leadership in software, finance, and research. China is trying to move up the value chain while preserving the industrial machine that made it powerful in the first place. Neither transition is guaranteed, and both are expensive. I have a suspicion that future historians may look back at this period and laugh at some of our debates. We spent years arguing about social media narratives while ports, factories, electrical grids, and shipping networks quietly determined the shape of the global economy. Infrastructure is boring right up until it becomes the most important thing in the room. Then everyone notices at once. There's another lesson here. Countries often mistake consumption for strength. A nation can buy a lot and still struggle to produce. A nation can have extraordinary financial wealth and still discover that certain capabilities have become difficult to rebuild. Likewise, a country can dominate manufacturing and still remain vulnerable to demographics, debt, and external demand. Power in this century is increasingly hybrid. That's the phrase I'd use. Hybrid power. The ability to innovate and manufacture, to finance and build, to write software and pour concrete, to invent the future and physically assemble it. And that's why I don't think the port rankings are merely a shipping story. They're a reminder that beneath every digital economy sits a physical one. Every cloud rests on steel racks. Every smartphone began in a factory. Every AI model ultimately depends on ships carrying equipment, minerals, and components around the planet. Containers don't trend online. They don't go viral. They don't generate outrage cycles. They just keep moving, or they don't. And when they stop, entire economies suddenly remember how much of modern life depends on cranes, dock workers, rail lines, and giant steel boxes crossing the ocean. My opinion is this. America's biggest strategic risk isn't that China has 6 of the world's 10 busiest ports. It's that parts of the American elite spent too long treating logistics and manufacturing as secondary concerns, as activities that happen somewhere else and could always be purchased later. History suggests that's a dangerous assumption. My doubt is whether the United States can rebuild industrial capacity fast enough. Infrastructure takes time, skilled labor takes time, supply chains take time. Democracies can absolutely do hard things, but they often rediscover urgency only after a shortage appears. And my prediction is that over the next 10 years, we're going to see a strange convergence. China will try to become more innovative and technologically self-sufficient. America will try to become more industrial. Each side will end up borrowing elements of the other's model, because neither has found the perfect formula. Remember the opening line. China has 6 of the world's 10 busiest ports. America has the world's busiest Twitter account about China. That joke works because there's a grain of truth inside it. But if Washington is serious about competing, I suspect the next chapter won't be written on social media. It'll be written in shipyards, substations, container terminals, and factories that haven't been built yet. If you enjoyed this one, subscribe and come back for the next conversation. The world usually changes quietly first, and only later starts trending.